From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
I've always thought that if it came to it, whatever it may be, I wouldn't want to linger, I wouldn't want to hang around.
We've probably all thought, at some point, in a roundabout way, of what we'd like the end of our life to look like, particularly if we got ill. For the much-loved broadcaster Mark Mardell, it was something he used to joke about with his family.
So I said, and this is an example of really, really bad parenting, to my eldest son, who was, I guess, about 18 at that time. If it ever came to it, I wanted to take me to a beach in Thailand, give me a big fat spliff, and enough drugs to kill me in a sort of psychedelic haze. And of course, I said it as a joke, but I mean, it wasn't a very funny joke for him, I guess, and I hadn't reflected on, A, what it would be like if he really did do it, because he'd be charged with murder. I mean, assisted dying is not legal in Thailand. It's certainly not legal if you use illegal drugs to do it.
Double whammy.
Double whammy. So that was a very, very, very bad idea, I think. I mean, it's only recently that I started reflecting about that joke and how silly it was and how you do need something in place, I think, to cope with that sort of feeling, if that's what you want to do. And I want to make it absolutely clear, I have no intention whatsoever of killing myself. I loathe the idea of suicide. I just love life.
Tomorrow, in Parliament, MPs will be debating a proposed bill on assisted dying. If the bill passes, it would make it possible for people who have a terminal illness and just 6 months to live to receive help in ending their lives. It's an issue that sparked a fierce moral and ethical debate amongst MPs, religious leaders, and the public.
You can go and live fully with a terminal diagnosis every single day, knowing that if one day that changes, if you're in unbearable, untreatable pain, which is possible, that you will have the ability to end that pain in a really dignified and calm manner.
The religious conviction, and that cuts right across all the religions, life is a gift of God and therefore has to be offered the ultimate dignity right until its natural end.
If the state agrees that somebody's better off dead, I think we're in a very dangerous place. Far better than this terribly dangerous step. What we should be doing is investing properly in high-quality end-of-life care for everybody.
We all want to die in a dignified and in a loving way, and we want to die in our own beds at home. We don't want to schlep to a foreign country, to Switzerland, to some industrial estate.
The story today, the debate about death that split the country.
Hello, I'm Mark Mardell. I'm one of the 6 movers and shakers. It's a podcast about living with Parkinson's. I'm also assisted dying editor or correspondent, or whatever you want to call it, for Prospect magazine. But you might know me better, as they used to say on The Simpsons, as somebody who used to work for the BBC as Europe editor, North America editor, political editor of Newsnight, covering politics in various guises, and then ended up doing radio presentation of The World This Weekend. So got a fair bit of broadcasting experience, I guess, behind me. But my voice is now weaker because of my diagnosis, so apologies for that.
Mark, we're all friends. We've worked together for many years.
Yeah.
You do have one of the most recognisable voices in broadcasting. Just tell us a bit about your diagnosis and how it has affected you.
Well, I was diagnosed a couple of years ago with Parkinson's, which is a neurodegenerative disease, a progressive disease, as they say. Progressive usually means good, and not in this case. Parkinson's used to be called the shaking palsy, or that's how Dr. Parkinson first defined it. I don't have much of a tremor. I don't really have a tremor at all. But it's got 47 symptoms. And in my case, it means, as I say, a weaker voice, and staggering around a lot, being slow. It's still at the stage of being annoying rather than hateful. I mean, well, it is hateful sometimes, but I find it more and more difficult to walk. So not great, but bearing up.
And Mark, in your new role as assisted dying correspondent for Prospect magazine, this is something you're thinking about a lot. What are your thoughts on assisted dying? Or, what were they when you took up the role?
Oh, well, when I took up the role, they were fairly straightforward because I hadn't really thought about it a great deal. I mean, I had thought about it a little bit. My thoughts are basically that it's a good thing to have the law changed. But my worries are twofold about this particular bill, or generally about assisted dying, that most of the legislation doesn't include the idea of suffering, which is extraordinary because that's what it's about, is preventing suffering. And the other thing that's a bigger problem, I mean, if I ever reached a stage where I did want to die, I'm not sure I'd be capable of saying it or articulating it. So unless you've got some sort of advanced declaration, unless you've got that, then how do you do that? So I think they are the flaws with the whole debate. And if you widen them up, then you possibly do go down a slippery slope. Not an expression I like, but I mean, it is what the opponents say, that as soon as you get a law through, it's going to get widened and widened.
So Parkinson's alone wouldn't be reason to qualify you for under the current bill?
Yeah, because we're told that Parkinson's is something you don't die of, you die with. In other words, it's very difficult to say to anybody, you've only got 6 months to live. Although Parkinson's can leave you in a pretty horrible place. Not necessarily, it doesn't always, and you can be killed by other things, but there is a strong possibility, if you sort of survive long enough, that you end up in a pretty horrible way because, you might be doubly incontinent, unable to speak at all, possibly blind, all sorts of horrible things that you wouldn't want to live with.
We'll come back to Mark in just a moment, but this is a really complicated moral and scientific dilemma. So for a little advice, we turn to our in-house expert on both.
So my name is Burgess, and I have an unusual dual role, which is I am religious affairs correspondent and also science reporter at The Times.
And in a way, the subject of assisted dying fits quite perfectly into both of those. You are the man to talk to on this.
Indeed. I mean, I also did a little bit of cover for our health correspondent a few years ago, so I have written about the subject from the point of view of what are doctors and physicians saying about it, but probably more so from what are archbishops and imams and rabbis saying about the matter and how they try to express that in a way that the public makes sense of, even if perhaps they're not religious themselves.
Well, Kaya, in a way, the fact that this is now being discussed very seriously in Parliament as a bill that might be adopted, might become a law, feels like a huge cultural shift in this country. So take us back a few generations. How have attitudes in this country changed to the idea of death and the idea of suicide, the idea of taking your life at a point that you determine?
Well, the whole attitude to suicide is kind of fascinating. It's sort of scarcely believable that it used to be a criminal offence to commit suicide, which obviously seems slightly bizarre. But of course, it meant that people who attempted suicide and had a failed suicide attempt could be prosecuted, which obviously heaps another horror on top of whatever mental health issue they were going through beforehand. Amazingly, up to the beginning of the 19th century, it was considered usual to bury someone who'd committed suicide at a crossroad with a stake through the body. They weren't allowed to be buried in churchyards until about the 1820s, when they were allowed to be buried in churchyards, but only between 9 p.m. and midnight and with no burial rites according to the Church of England, which is kind of mad to think of. 1880s, it was changed again to say, okay, they can be buried at any time of the day with some rites of the church. It was actually only in 2017, so when I'd started doing the religious affairs job at the Times, that the General Synod formally changed its laws to say we're going to remove those kind of bars entirely, mainly because priests had been doing that anyway. But it still retains this idea in there that a priest can refuse to conduct a funeral of someone who's committed suicide if that's part of what their conscience believes. So it still remains this kind of stigma is associated with it.
So in terms of religion, suicide-assisted dying definitely frowned upon. Even the law, though, in this country has changed, as you say.
Well, I mean, so much of the law in this country clearly was informed by Christian theology for a long time. And if you go back to theologians like Thomas Aquinas, he was one of the ones who said it's a mortal sin to commit suicide because life is a gift from God and therefore you are kind of violating that. That was a kind of a major thing. But it was illegal in civil law until 1961, amazingly. And I looked back and there's a Times leader on the subject from 1956, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, which found that 613 people in 1956 were prosecuted and 33 people were sent to prison in the 50s for having attempted suicide. So it was up to that point still considered a crime. In the church's own kind of laws, the phraseology is it denied funerals to those who, being of sound mind, have laid violent hands upon themselves. And so it really was this kind of taboo that people were being prosecuted after having suffered already.
Yeah. And you mentioned how the church has sort of changed its mind on that. It's now, it's much easier to have a funeral for somebody who killed themselves than it would have been in the past.
Yes.
What about the medical profession? I mean, not so much on suicide, but certainly on the idea of assisted dying. How much have things changed there?
See, that's a really interesting one. I mean, people sometimes discuss the Hippocratic Oath and they talk about this idea that it has a phrase in it saying, do no harm. There's a little bit of mythology around that in that doctors don't all swear some agreed text which states this. No doctors actually have to swear any kind of oath in the UK.
Really? I always assumed there was sort of, it's a bit like when you're in a court trial or something, there's a little passage you have to read.
So no, it's not quite true. Most medical schools and universities, they do in the graduation ceremony have some sort of wording which sort of one would recognise as being along those sorts of lines of a Hippocratic Oath. Some of them have different phrases in them that talk about, I will do my best to alleviate pain and suffering, which I suppose some people might say, well, you could read into that perhaps it being okay for assisted dying in that sense. But usually they do contain something about I will not cause harm to patients. The idea in the public consciousness that doctors have this overriding goal to preserve life as much as possible is what has always, in most of the big medical associations, British Medical Association, BMA, Royal College of Physicians, they generally had an opposition to assisted dying. What's changed in the last few years is I don't think any have come out to support it, but they've passed these resolutions changing their position from one of formal opposition to one of neutrality, which is quite interesting, which has increased the space for debate on the subject. Now that those doctors are essentially, by doing that, saying, well, look, we're open to discussion. They haven't kind of come out and backed it, but it's been quite fine margins in the votes.
And in terms of society, how much has changed? How has the idea of assisted dying changed culturally?
Different opinion polls ask slightly different questions in their wording in terms of, do you in principle support assisted dying, or would you personally consider it? And so it's hard to track it over a long period of time. Interestingly, the proportions who say they support it vary anywhere from 65 to about 83%, but it's always, all the polls I've seen in the last 10 years say there's public support for it. The opposition is quite constant at about 13%, and the don't knows tend to be the varying ones. So there's public support for it. It would seem. When you drill down in those surveys into the nitty-gritty of what safeguards should there be, that can lead things to kind of fluctuate slightly. But the interesting thing is that, I've made a note here of the various occasions when this has gone to Parliament, and MPs are very much against it. 1997, it was defeated by 234 votes to 89 in the Commons. 2005, it was defeated. It was defeated in Scotland in 2010. It was defeated in Parliament in Westminster in 2015 again. So it's interesting to see that public opinion has been pro it, but MPs less so.
If you're enjoying this episode of The Story, you can listen to more by subscribing to the podcast. It's completely free, and we'll put a link below in the description box for different ways you can follow us. Kaya, you've been telling us how views on assisted dying have changed over time amongst the public. Tomorrow in Parliament, they'll be discussing a new bill about assisted dying, which could become a law if it's passed. What exactly does it propose?
So, if you're a terminally ill adult who's been told you have a prognosis of less than 6 months for your condition, then you can seek help to end your life. That's what the bill is proposing. The patient has to have the mental capacity to actually make that choice for themselves, has to be deemed to have expressed a clear, settled and informed wish, free from any coercion or pressure from others. And then for the decision to go ahead, they need 2 doctors and a High Court judge to back that decision, that they are eligible in the first place and that they are doing so voluntarily. Now, under the bill, a doctor can help to prepare the substance, but the actual person themselves has to be the one who actually administers it. No doctor or anyone else, families or loved ones, would be allowed to actually administer the medication to the terminally ill person. And also doctors would not be under any actual legal obligation to take part in the assisted dying process at all. One of the other safeguards in the bill is that it would be illegal for someone to pressure or coerce or trick, use dishonesty to get someone to declare that they wish to end their life or sort of induce somebody to self-administer one of the approved substances. And there would be a jail sentence of up to 14 years if anyone was found guilty of any of these actions. The issue that's being debated, first of all, how can doctors and a High Court judge be sure there is no coercion from people who may wish that person to end their life? But not only that, not just being coerced, but people who might feel they sort of have a duty, they don't want to be a burden on their loved ones, and so they're not being coerced into it, but they might sort of feel like, some people talked about the right to die might become a duty to die for some people.
My opposition to the bill is actually not religious. It's more practical about the state of palliative care, end-of-life care in our country, and the extent to which the failures in palliative care mean that assisted dying wouldn't give people a real choice. It would become not a right to die, but effectively an obligation to die because the support isn't there for good end-of-life care where it should be.
And what safeguards there would be to ensure that some other countries that have gone down a process of widening it to people having a mental health crisis or other issues without necessarily being terminally ill. How can safeguards be put in place once you've crossed that kind of tipping point of we're okay with assisted dying? How do you stop it from being expanded afterwards? So those will be the key issues. In terms of the religious reaction, there are notable exceptions. I'll come to those in one second, but you've got people opposing it. The Cardinal, Vincent Nichols, who's the Archbishop of Westminster from the Catholic Church, very strongly opposed.
While it looks a very simple question that people should have the right to end their lives when they want to, there's an underlying question is, do we possess our lives? Is it a possession that we have to dispose of according to a practical judgment of whether it's too difficult or too burdensome? So the religious conviction, and that cuts right across all the religions, life is a gift of God and therefore has to be offered the ultimate dignity right until its natural end.
Church of England is opposed. The Bishop of London, she is also the former chief nursing officer for England. She's strongly opposed. You've seen a number of people from Jewish, Muslim, Hindu and Sikh communities opposing it as well in a joint letter this weekend. Former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, Lord Williams, he opposes it. Interestingly, his predecessor, Lord Carey of Clifton, is in favour of assisted dying.
Really?
He sort of thinks there's no Christian imperative to, I think he puts it as prolonging people's agony if they don't wish to. Jonathan Romain, who is a rabbi, a senior rabbi from the Reform, sort of liberal progressive Judaism movement, he also supports it. He refers to it as, rather than it being shortening life, it's shortening death. And that he feels that there's a compassionate religious argument to be made there. But they seem to be in the minority among religious leaders who've spoken out.
And Mark, just tell us a bit about how it's working in other countries, and are there things from their systems that you think we should be adopting if we go ahead with a law on assisted dying?
It is that judge business that's unique to the proposal here, because the 6-month and the terminal diagnosis exist in many other places around the world, including most of the 11 states in the USA that have it, and I think the 6th states of Australia that have it. And a doctor I spoke to from California has said the proof of the pudding is that nobody wants to constrict it. Yes, they do want to expand it to a certain degree. Criteria do get looser because he says that's what people want. I've just written a big piece on Canada, and I think that's a very interesting example because it is where the slippery slope is most obvious that it is happening. But I think the bill in Canada originally suffered from these two, as I see it, flaws. Doesn't mention suffering, and basically was restricted to, it wasn't 6 months terminal in that case, it was reasonably foreseeable death.
And Canada has had a lot of attention when it comes to the debate around assisted dying. Why is that?
I think in Canada it has been expanded because of judicial activism. Basically the courts, and they've got a constitution, like most countries, unlike us. So people went back to the constitution and said it's unconstitutional, you're denying me my constitutional rights by saying you're not allowing me to die and all that sort of thing. So it was gradually expanded. And Quebec has gone the furthest by quite illegal. I mean, some people are saying it's literally, the government has literally turned a blind eye to murder in Quebec because what they're proposing is still illegal under the general system.
And just describe how much further it goes. Why are people describing it as murder?
Well, for a start, because it is murder according to the criminal code. That is still illegal under the general national Canadian criminal code. But they're turning a blind eye to the way the law's been changed. So that's why it's being called murder. But the most alarming thing I saw was one doctor who said he wouldn't take part. He has taken part in assisted dying in the past. But he's saying, if you've got somebody who says, something like, I can't recognise my children anymore, you can kill me. He was saying, well, you'd have to carry that out, which is clearly not in the law because it says as long as you can give a little signal that you don't want it, you don't have to. But he said, trouble is with people with dementia, and I think Alzheimer's is particularly mentioned in this law, then if you start touching them, start trying to treat them, they will struggle. And he said you'd have to strap them down and put a canicle in or whatever you call it. And the family, he said, would see that as an execution. Well, I'd see it as an execution. I think it's outrageous that even doctors are speculating on that. So in that sense, I think Canada's gone perhaps too far.
I suppose so much of how this law plays out will come down to the culture around it. And that's the fear of coercion, that if it becomes so commonplace, people will look at relatives of a certain age who are sick or perhaps their lives have become difficult and almost expect them to take up the right to assisted dying. I mean, it's such a complicated picture. What do you make of that argument?
I think you're right, and I'm just struggling with this at the moment, really, that I think is possibly what campaigners against it are worried about, is a whole change in the attitude towards dying and suicide. And do people feel that they're a burden? Well, I guess they do, and I think that, can do. And I don't know how you legislate for that. I think you can try, as this bill strongly does, to protect people from the pressure being put on them. But I think it's very difficult to sort of legislate against internal pressure.
Yeah, but this could be a moment where society almost expects it of people who...
Yes, and that's what has given me pause. I'm just in the middle of writing something on disability campaigners, and I was quite struck and surprised the disability campaigners who I thought, in my ignorance, would be in favour are very much against it, or a lot of them are, not obviously everybody. And my assumption sort of made flesh their worst fears, that people assume if you're disabled you might want to die, because it's not very pleasant. And several people have made the point that it's such a struggle being disabled if you're not well off, if you're stuck in circumstances where you're always struggling against the local council, local authority, whatever, to put in that ramp, to do that, to help you there. That it's such a struggle that in the end it can just be exhausting, and you might just think dying is the better option. And they're outraged, I think, a lot of people, that the assumption is they ought to be thinking of killing themselves, and that if society is willing to spend a lot of money on assisted dying, why isn't it not a lot of willing to spend a lot of money on helping disabled people live a full life. And I think that is a powerful argument. I think what they're really worried about, or all the campaigners, whether it's on religious grounds or disability or anything else, is a change in the culture where suicide becomes, or killing yourself at the end of your life, becomes the natural way of doing things.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big jump, isn't it? And I don't know that I want to go there. In a new version of my beach in Thailand with the spliff and the speedball or whatever, I can imagine when really things come to a head, lying there in your bed, surrounded by your family, taking a draught of something, and that being quite a pleasant way to go. But I think, that's something a bit chilling about if that becomes an automatic assumption that people will do that. So I think it has to be sort of an extreme choice that is only applied to a few people to feel comfortable with it.
That was the broadcaster and writer who's covering assisted dying for Prospect magazine, Mark Mardell, and Kaya Burgess, science and religious affairs correspondent for The Times. The Times and the Sunday Times will have extensive coverage of the bill online at thetimes.com, and there'll be live coverage and more debate on Times Radio all day tomorrow. If you've been affected by any of the themes in this episode, particularly the discussion of suicide, and if you'd like to speak to someone about it, then we've put the contact details of a few groups who might be able to help in the description notes to this episode. The producer today was Edward Drummond, the executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Maula Seto. If you'd like to get in touch with us with any comments on assisted dying or any other subject, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.